That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre. Hello and welcome to The Fear of God, episode 16. We are a podcast exploring the horror genre through the lens of Christianity, and I am one of your hosts, Reed Lackey.
And I am also one of your hosts, Nathan Rouse.
We are very, very excited about today's episode specifically. Not that there's anything particularly exciting about the number 16, but a while back we posted a listener survey to allow listeners the opportunity to select some of our upcoming content. And we got a lot of responses to them. We're very grateful for all of those responses. And one of them specifically, we gave you a number of choices. And by a wide margin, the film that you wanted us to talk about was today's film. And we are talking today, once we get fully into it, we are talking today about the film from 2012 called The Cabin in the Woods. I'm very, very, very excited about this.
Hey, Reed, what were the other selections? I can't remember.
I remember one of them was The Omen from 1976. I know one of them was The Mist. One of them was Drag Me to Hell from 2009. And I forget what the final one is. I'd have to look back at it. But yeah, by a wide margin, Cabin in the Woods won out. I think most of I think everything got maybe one or two votes, but then all of the rest of the votes went to Cabin in the Woods.
Well, and arguably, I mean, we did watch Cabin in the Woods based on voter selection, but arguably, I think Tuesday night we also all watched Drag Me to Hell together as a nation.
Yes. See, listeners, you should probably know that we are recording this right now. Even though you're hearing it the first week of December, we're recording it the second week of November. And I'm sure you guys were around to understand.
For all of that. I don't know how you might have missed that, but, you know, it's been it's been a somber week.
Yeah, it really has been. I know listeners thus far really haven't commented on the time delay. I know it might seem a bit strange for us to be talking about what is to us current events in a little bit of a time loop because, you know, we're talking about current events about a month late. But yeah, it's been a tumultuous week for a lot of people, given the results of the election. And so, yeah, I mean, we press on. I know I specifically, maybe you too, Nathan, was reached out to. People said, yeah, you should just do a podcast on the election season. And I responded, typically, that was too frightening even for me to try to mine substance from.
It did occur to me that, you know, we don't really have to watch anything. We can just sort of talk about what's going on in the world.
Yeah. And
but all that said, enough dourness, and, you know, scary, too much of the scary. Let's jump into talking about Cabin in the Woods, unless there is another element you'd like to talk about, Reed.
Nope. Let's do it. I'm really excited about this conversation, so let's have it.
All right, let's do it. So I saw Cabin in the Woods in the theater, when it came out, and then rewatched it for our podcast today. Had you, I mean, you know, is this like The Babadook? Is this like, It Follows? Are you in the half a dozen at this point yet? It's okay if you are. I'm not making fun. I'm just curious.
Sure. I also saw this movie in the theater. I went with a buddy of mine, Brian, to go see this in the theater. And
shout out Brian.
And then when I got it on DVD, well, Blu-ray, Let's get it right. Let's get the format right. When I got it on Blu-ray, I have since seen it. I think this last night's viewing to prepare for this episode was my 5th time watching it, I want to say. So yeah, I mean, I've seen it quite a bit, but unlike The Babadook and It Follows, this has had a couple of years to gain some repeat viewings.
Sure.
Most notably, I believe it was last year at Halloween, or it might have been the year prior, but within the last 2 years, we had a big group of people over after Halloween festivities, and Cabin in the Woods is the film that we watched. And, it was, much fun was had by all, because let's face it, as much as we're about to dive in and talk about it, this is undeniably, I think, a very fun movie.
It is a very fun movie. And it should be mentioned, Reed, that viewers won't know this, but despite the fact we're talking about Cabin in the Woods, I feel a little bit like we're in the movie Unfriended right now, because this is typically our typical mode of recording is literally just earphones or however we record, but no visual element, except for when I was out there visiting you. And for the first time with this recording, we are testing out Skyping and earphoning and all sorts of, I feel like a cyborg a little bit with all these wires coming out of my body. But that said, I can see you and you can see me and I can see a little version of me. So I'm worried that at any moment there's going to be a little strange icon pop up that is intercepting our call. And and that person you killed a number of years ago, we're going to find out is back from the dead and attacking us.
Oh my gosh. That'll be my confession time to everybody. Like, oh wait, so something listeners should know about.
That'd be terrible.
Oh man.
You don't have any blenders in that room, do you?
No, I don't. Thank God.
Good. Anyway, enough of that silliness. Onto the Cabin in the Woods. So for me, I, like I said, second time viewing it, and I'm a bit of a sleepy Sally these days and go to bed a little early. And so I watched it last night, and despite, you and I had this conversation off mic earlier today, despite being quite tired in the watching of it, still thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, it's just a fun flick. It's got that sort of Whedon snap and the banter, the clever writing, the, really funny setup, punchline kind of humor that he employs so well. And just set against the backdrop of a pretty, I don't know if you would agree with this, but it's pretty dark.
Oh,
it's a very
absolutely.
kind of, if I may use this word, nihilistic kind of flick.
I think that's an appropriate word.
But nonetheless, very fun. So it was enjoyable to jump back in. And I did see it in the theater before I was that aware of these two actors, but was pleasantly reminded of Chris Hemsworth, of course, of Thor fame. And though I don't really watch it, my wife is an avid Grey's Anatomy fan, so immediately recognized Jesse Williams' name. And so that was kind of fun to see him in that. He's a regular on that series. And just a really interesting dude besides. But that's a whole other thing. So yeah, that was fun. That was fun for me to see. If we're steering into likes, dislikes, again, I find that this is one of those movies, and no immediate comparison is coming to mind. Maybe you can help out with this, where I remember watching it the first time and having no real idea at first what's going on. This sort of parallel action of the scientists or whatever they are, that first viewing where you're just kind of confused is too strong a word, but just unsure exactly what's going on. And I sort of wish you could have that experience again, but it is fun rewatching it, knowing what's going on and just being able to pay more attention to the layers that are put in by way of those, the Bradley Whitford, Richard Jenkins characters. So that's just a really fun sort of parallel story that's happening there. And I'm just kind of rambling at this point. Is there something you'd like to jump in? Jump in on?
I'll definitely say, part of the fun of seeing it for the first time, which, I mean, obviously this is a listener voted episode, so I have a strong feeling, a pretty safe bet that most of our listeners have seen this. I think that the first viewing of this film, half the fun is for most of the movie trying to figure out what's going on, what role the Bradley Whitford, Richard Jenkins characters have to do with our, Chris Hemsworth, Jesse Williams character, and trying to see where those stories intersect. They do a really deft job of sort of dropping breadcrumbs across the way of like, hey, here's something that will pay off later. And 5 minutes later, oh, here's another thing that's going to pay off either in a joke or a plot point in just a little bit. But I think half the fun of that first viewing is trying to figure out what's going on. And then I know for me, once it's sort of revealed exactly what's happening to these people, I found it terribly inventive. I thought it was just wonderful that everything came together in a kind of an homage of the horror genre in general. It very, very much also a love letter to the horror genre. And so I found it to be just an incredibly clever concept. I think that the script is wonderful. Drew Goddard and Joss Whedon on the script. Drew Goddard was the director. I don't know if we mentioned that in the top of the episode, but just an absolutely fantastic script. In my opinion, I think one of the strongest scripts for, a horror story or like a concept like this of any that I've ever seen. So, I have a couple of nits to pick, but those are very, very minor. I think it's a really, really great script.
Yeah. And I think that, I just really enjoyed that experience of trying to figure out exactly what's going on. And we talk a lot on our show about, what would or wouldn't make for good sequels. And a lot of the movies we have discussed have gone on to breed multiple sequels. I think something that's fun about this movie, although, spoiler alert, the movie itself doesn't seem to lend much potential for a sequel, based on how it ends, but it is fun to consider that basement scene as, theoretically they could have shot 3 different movies, and branched different directions purely based on what sort of artifact the characters ended up engaging with. And that was a really fun, to just sort of ponder that story potential there.
Have you ever seen the movie Clue from the 80s?
I'm ashamed to admit, because all of our mutual college theater peers are such avid fans of it. I've actually never seen Clue. Well,
Clue is a lot of fun. I mean, Clue is a very fun movie, but the reason I bring it up is because it is my understanding, though I was not old enough to see it in the theater, it is my understanding that when it was released to the theater, it was released with 3 different endings, and you did not know until seeing the film which ending you were going to get. And nobody that I'm aware of has really tried that concept again. But I'm hearing you talk about it. I'm like, how much fun would it be to show like the cabin in the woods premise? It's too late now because everybody already knows kind of what's going on. But if you were to take a premise like Cabin in the Woods and release 3 different films, and maybe they have the identical beginning and the identical ending, but the middle part is the part where things just go a little differently, and you don't know until you see the film which version of that you're going to get. And then, of course, they could have a lot of fun with the Blu-ray with, all 3 films having their own separate thing, get a different guest director for, quick! To the typewriter. This is an idea.
Well, and you used a word just a second ago that I think is very appropriate for this movie. It's just inventive. Like, I love the little grace notes of the scientists or, lab, whatever they are, the professional guys. And you see the Japanese monster stuff happening. I mean, it's just so inventive, and there's clearly some competitiveness between, the American monster controlling center and the Japanese monster controlling center. And I can't remember if they reference another one or not. But on pure, just like, if we're talking just fun things, I mean, the movie's littered with lines that are just really clever. And you said just a second ago, one of the brilliant facets of this movie is just the setup and the payoff later. And this wasn't initially where I was going with this line of thought, but the part where Bradley Whitford loses the bet and says, "I always wanted to see a merman."
Oh, yeah.
which is in itself a very humorous line, just once you've started to understand the context of the movie, but then has just a really fantastic payoff at the end. A really disgusting payoff, truthfully, but it is excellently executed.
Oh, it's so wonderful.
Well, so that one, and then, so this is a random aside, but when I was in high school, I don't know if you know this or not. When I was in high school, we did a senior project at the high school I went to where it was meant to be this sort of culmination of all these sort of skills and whatever you learned a lot of people kind of phoned it in. A lot of people did crazy things. One guy faked a meeting with Jimmy Carter, and I don't know if he ended up passing or not, but whatever. Wow. For me personally, I wanted to make a movie. And so you had to have like this community person in the community who had some skill set related to what you were doing, and they were your contact. Well, I made, and it's, it's actually on my NathanRouse.com website. You could go see it. I don't know if you ever watched this. It's called Shout. And it is a spoof of Scream, because this is 1997, 98.
I already love it.
The killer, well, you should go watch it. The killer kills people with Shout laundry detergent. So this is what he does. But we had the Scream mask. That's actually not the point of it. The point of this story is I love lines that just really make no sense and are so stupid, but lend some immediate backstory. And I'm going to tie this into Cabin in the Woods in just a second, but in Shout, there's a scene, and it's so dumb, but God bless her, Michelle Turner, you'll never listen to this, but if you do, good work. This friend of mine is in the scene. You think she's about to be killed by the killer with the Shout laundry detergent. It gets kicked out of his hand, and she catches it, and she says, like, you forgot, I'm the catcher for the softball team. It's so stupid. But right, exactly. Like the fact that she caught a thing meant that she was on the softball team. But where I'm going with this is one of the best lines in this movie, maybe any movie, is when Chris Hemsworth gets on the motorcycle, which we've seen in the movie, but has no context yet. You know what I mean? Like there's no,
right.
We just see, okay, they're taking a motorcycle, and Jesse Williams says something because they're trying to get back, you know, and the landslide has happened and the tunnel's caved in, and they're trying to get away from the cabin in the woods. And there's this like 5-foot jump that they just can't get over. And Jesse Williams is like, what are we going to do? And the next shot is Chris Hemsworth on this motorbike. And Jesse Williams is like, just be careful. You're going to have to gun it. And Chris Hemsworth, there's no context to this whatsoever in the movie. His line is, I've done bigger jumps than this, you know, and it's like this great, just stupid line that is just perfect in this movie, you know, like, yeah. What is he? Is he a stunt cyclist? You know, like just this Evel Knievel kind of character. Just, we have no backstory for this up till now. And he just says, I got it. I've done bigger jumps than this. That's going to be my new like go-to line in life when someone's like, now be careful, Nathan, with whatever you're doing. I'll just be like, listen, I've done bigger jumps than this. That's going to be my new life motto.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. I think one of my favorite parts in the film in terms of like, humor is the moment when, the Harbinger, as he's called, the creepy guy from the gas station, when he calls in and
they put him on speakerphone,
and then he's just sitting there talking away, and then all of a sudden he's just like, I'm on speakerphone, aren't I? And the best thing is Bradley Whitford's like, oh, I'm sorry, let me take you off, and of course doesn't do it, and then he goes on for like another 30 seconds or something and goes, I'm still on speakerphone, aren't I?
Well, the beauty of that scene is he's just ranting this arcane, prophetic, mishmash, horror, you know, Cthulhu kind of gobbledygook. And then all of a sudden, wait a minute, I'm on speakerphone. You know, oh, it's great. It's great.
He totally drops his character for them. And it's just, oh my gosh. It is, oh man, it is funny. Something, you know, there is a wealth of trivia to be had about this film, but I think the film is chock full of like really, really nice winks and nods to the horror genre at large. Sure. I think that's part of the appeal of the film is that, you know, even in its title, The Cabin in the Woods, I think you even said in an earlier episode that we were recording, you know, that's where all the scary stuff happens. You know, that is sort of the iconic Sam Raimi really sort of most prominently capitalized on that Cabin in the Woods idea with the Evil Dead movies, but he's of course not the only person to do it. And it's interesting because I feel like the film is very evocative of a lot of things that it directly addresses a lot of things, but then it's also very evocative of things it doesn't even have to address. That it just sort of feels, I mean, if you were to examine the specific plots of tons of horror films, they don't line up to the archetypes of what's been laid out as the conceit of this film, but it still feels very much like they probably all do. You know, I think that's the brilliance of how the script is sort of generic enough to make you feel like this is every horror film, even though it's categorically its own specific horror film and is maybe really only similar tangentially to probably 5 or 6 of the multitude of horror films that are out there. But it kind of feels like it's like all of them. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that they show horror films from different regions, or they show horror scenarios from different regions.
Sure.
They focus a lot on the Japanese because in the narrative of this film, the Japanese always get the number 1 spot and America always comes in second, which I think that's hysterical. But, so that's the idea behind all of these different regions, that supposedly they all have their own sort of boogeyman horror in the monstrous scenario. And that's part of why I think it feels like it's every horror film. Every horror film is doing what this film is doing. And I really enjoy that. As a horror fan, I love that.
Well, and they were able to craft a narrative that organically serves all of those conventions in a very, to repeat myself, very organic way. I mean, it just, it's giving winks, nods, homages, all of the above to all these different horror genres and styles, while at the same time being its very own narrative, which, yeah, I mean, as you're saying, it's just it's a real feat of storytelling to be able to pull that off so well.
Yeah. So it's hard for me to, this is funny because I mostly consider this film funny more than I do scary. But do you have any specific, scare moments or scary things?
I wouldn't totally disagree with that assessment. I did, again, having seen it already, I can't remember 3 or 4 years ago when I first saw it to know what might have scared me then. I mean, there were a few jump moments, like the scene between him and her in the woods where you see her hand reach out to the hand stabbing.
Yes.
That's very sudden. That was a good little jump moment. But, I really think that, and we can camp out on this as much as we want, but just the whole elevator sequence, I mean, is very dark. And, if you let your mind go there, it's a deeply troubling sequence of scenes. But what I wrote down, specifically was he got killed by a unicorn. What a terrible, at the same time, highly comedic and yet dreadfully awful scene,
oh yeah.
Cause this unicorn stabs this dude 3 times. This is meant to be the essence and paragon of all that is good in our imagination is the unicorn.
Yeah.
And it just totally shish kebabs this soldier guy.
I know. Well, and that's, it's very similar to the merman's appearance, if you will, where it's you're kind of disgusted, but it's undeniably hilarious,
Sure.
And as you said, a tremendous, sizable payoff for the couple of littered, merman jokes that are in there. I mean, it is definitely potentially very nerve-wracking or very scary to think about this, but I know it is probably a horror fan's dream to, as the elevator pans out and you see all of the shifting cubes and you catch. I mean, I caught when I watched it again, and I haven't refreshed myself on exactly what all is specifically intentionally there. I mean, obviously you see the giant spider, which is horrifying, and then also Stephen King's Pennywise is very clearly represented prominently, as are, I believe, the twins from The Shining are in a different cubicle. And so it's just...
Well, that whole sequence where the elevator is paused and the ballet kid, which is disgusting.
Wow.
And the buzzsaw head guy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a real, to just have that in the frame and him just stand there is very haunting. That's
absolutely.
Very, very scary imagery.
That, who you dubbed the buzzsaw head guy, just, our fans are going to get us if we don't mention. That is not a specific reference. Well, I think it is a specific reference to, it's meant to evoke,
Hellraiser?
The bad guys from the Hellraiser franchise, which are called Cenobites.
So you just threw me for a loop there. So I said Hellraiser. I don't know if you heard that, but Cenobites, that sounds like I'm going to go to the Cinnabon and get some
Doesn't
Cenobites.
it?
That's disgusting. Yeah. I will never do that again now.
Oh my gosh. No, and I apologize. Our feed must have cut out. I didn't hear you mention Hellraiser. Right. But yeah, the Cenobite, it does almost sound a little bit like breakfast. It's not, but
not anymore. It doesn't.
No, not after watching this. Well, and can we say, okay, so we're jumping kind of all over the place between like technical things, scary moments, everything like that. This film kind of lends itself to that. But I just want to know, Joss Whedon, Drew Goddard, whoever, why in the world is there a freaking system purge button in that lobby? Why in the world is there a button that just basically unleashes all the monsters? Like what? Right. What was anybody thinking to put in a button like, hey, let's just put a button that will literally set them all loose, set them all free. Right. I'm like, what in the way? And it's big and red and very prominent. Like, no. I mean, the thing that got me so much about that moment is that particular button that releases all the monsters. There's no glass case around it. There's no like key. You have no security whatsoever. Somebody could be bringing in a pizza and set it down on the counter. And then everybody just like, oh God, all of these monsters don't call
there's no like again. there's no like you need 3 keys, one on each person. It's just you hit the button.
That's all she does.
What if you accidentally lean against it?
Exactly.
You're touring the lab for the new guy. And he just sort of leans against it. That's just death to everyone.
The new intern just like pushes down on the. Hey guys, so this is a cool room. Oh crap! What does that do?
Oh no, merman!
Oh my gosh! I mean, it's just and I mean, I think that it's interesting the idea that all these monsters are somehow, just. I mean, the thing that struck me. I think for the first time, probably because I'm thinking about the film as I'm watching it, like when I watched it last night, this was the first time that I was watching it in light of trying to have a conversation about it, have a substantial conversation. And it was the first time that it stuck out to me that the building is very corporate looking. Like it all very much looks like, I was noticing, as Unicorn is stabbing the man to death, then you pan down the hall and you see administration this way, like,
right.
And so
very bureaucratic.
Exactly. Yeah. Very bureaucratic. And it was, I think that had to have been intentional, at least by look and design, the thought that struck me as I'm sitting there watching this is like, wow. So all of these monsters are just hiding in the walls of these corporate buildings. And I'm like, I think Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard are savvy enough social commentators that that's probably not an accident. It's probably very intentional. Sure. The idea of monsters hiding in the walls of a corporate building. I think there's a lot of things. Honestly, I don't know how long this particular episode's going to be, but I think it could easily be 3.5 hours because there's so many individual scenes, individual moments that you could point to and say like, well, yeah, this says this about this part of our understanding, our psyche. This other thing has some commentary, on a completely different element. It baffles me that at least the first draft of this was created in like 3 days. The first draft of this screenplay, Whedon and Goddard were basically frustrated a little bit after some failed Hollywood projects, and so they kind of they were friends. They got together and they were just like, let's write something for ourselves. Let's just write something fun for ourselves. Locked themselves into a hotel room for a weekend and hammered out this script, which I think is just so tremendously effective. I mean, I don't know how many changes it went through from that first 3-day draft to the finished product, maybe quite a few, but I just think it's a really fun film. I think it's an excellent film. I think it's got a lot of payoffs for anybody who's ever been or is now a fan of the horror genre. And it's not surprising at all to me that our listeners really wanted us to talk about it in general, because I think there's, just a ton to talk about.
In the spirit of that.
Yeah. So, man, I don't even know where to start thematically. I mean, it's, as I said before, even just talking about like moments and stuff like that, we could go all over the place. What I wrote down first is we all consider ourselves the main character in our own story, never really thinking about the fact that we're supporting characters in somebody else's. And it was something that struck me as they were, as they're coming to the realization that they are part of an orchestrated story. These 5 characters, they go out to the cabin in the woods, weird stuff starts going down, and then when they finally realize what's been happening, they come to discover that they are part of something much larger. And granted, they don't want to be part of that thing, and they openly rebel against that. But it struck me, this idea of, you're just going through your life. We're certainly navigating through things the way we want to, but we don't realize how much, and this is not something we need to spend a lot of time on, but we don't realize how much the things that we do and the things that happen to us are having these ripple effects everywhere else. Like, we are impacting stories that are all around us. Most of the time, we are completely oblivious to. As they initially are completely oblivious to Bradley Whitford and Richard Jenkins in the control room. They have no idea what's going on. And it made me think about all these things, not only about how we're impacting other things, but it's not lost on me that they are navigating through a story. And there's even a line in the film, I believe Richard Jenkins says, that they have free will, that they have to make the choice. But all along the way, they're being manipulated by little factors that they don't realize. The dye in the hair, the pheromones that they pump into the room at one point. There's a couple of times that, Bradley Whitford calls out for something that doesn't ultimately take fruition. Like when the character of Marty begins to figure out kind of what's going on, he, Bradley Whitford comes in there and starts asking for like 500 cc's of some tranquilizer. Sure. It's like they have all of these tools, these resources to manipulate them. And I just found it fascinating that these 5 characters are being manipulated, but are completely oblivious to it, with the exception of Marty, which we can talk about on a different subject in a second. I think that's deliberate, that it's Marty who is kind of aware before anybody else of what's going on. But I just thought that was interesting to think that we are often supporting players in something that we are patently unaware of, or at least not cognizant of, as we are.
And I think to kind of amplify that a little bit, you're sort of brushing up against this, and I think that we want so badly to believe that our comings and goings are a product of our own independent agency, often neglecting, not always neglecting, but often neglecting to recognize the sheer tonnage of elements in our surroundings and culture and environment and upbringing that are in fact influencing the decisions we make. And I think that, and it is hard. It is hard. You and I've talked personally on phone calls for years, and even occasionally on the podcast for months, just about discernment and what does it mean to kind of sift the things around you, and it's interesting watching the movie, and this is kudos to Whedon and Goddard, but at the start of the movie, you even have preconceived notions about these characters. Just, mean, Chris Hemsworth forever and ever will be the jock. I mean, he just has that physique. He's got that look, but they intentionally are trying to play against that in his characterization up front. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely it does. Yeah.
But then the movie and the forces at work within the movie totally steer him into that characterization. And so I think I think there is something going on there too about just, and what I wrote down in a very cursory manner was just media manipulation, but the advertising and the marketing that exists in our culture that, I have not studied this stuff at length, but, I know there's all this data about frequency of exposure to certain marketing and slogans and, the ability to attempt to sway you to purchase a thing or to engage in a thing that, we want to think is our own sort of devising, but ultimately is again the product of many external influences. And I think this movie really, really is fascinated with that subject.
Right.
And even more to that, the word we used a minute ago with bureaucratic, like even the Jenkins Whitford characters are just cogs in a wheel.
Yeah.
They're just doing their job.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I agree with you. That's a really fascinating sort of component of the movie.
And even too, like, to sort of go further with you mentioned the jock, but all of the archetypes that they have sort of at play that are necessary for these ancient ones, as they call them, to be appeased. You have the 5 categories are, you have the whore, the athlete, the scholar, the fool, and the virgin. But the film is constantly undermining and subverting our opinions about those types of roles. The idea of the quote unquote whore character in the film, Jules, she's in a committed relationship until she's thrust into this situation. She's in no way that stereotype. You already mentioned Chris Hemsworth as the athlete, the jock, but I think it's even more prominent in the character of Marty, who, again, this is what I was referencing earlier. I don't think it's a mistake at all that the fool of the stereotypical categorical fool is the one who almost from the very beginning knows what's really going on and suspects exactly what's happening. He doesn't know the details, but he, mentions like puppeteers and, we're being manipulated. And he's the one who has the reactions to like that scene where they're like, okay, stay together. Kurt, it's after Jules has been killed and they're like, okay, we're going to go exploring, stay together. They move forward. And then, Richard Jenkins pumps, this pheromone in and he's like, no, wait, this isn't right. We should split up. And Holden, the Jesse Williams character, is like, yeah, we should split up, cover more ground. And Marty's sitting there like, what? Like, are you serious? Like, he's always sort of aware of what's going on. And he's the one, even though Dana is our heroine, she's the protagonist, the primary protagonist of the story. Marty's the one who discovers the elevator. He's the one who sure. uncovers the entire entrance into this subverted world. And he's categorized as the fool. And so I think the film has some things to say about the flaws in categorizing people and in stereotyping people, that people do not break down that simply. I love that in the beginning of the film, you automatically think Chris Hemsworth is going to be the dumb jock character. And then he is clearly they say in the film, he's at college on an academic scholarship. And I thought that was a wonderful touch, that even though he knows how to throw a football, we've seen that in the opening, scene of the movie. Well, not the opening scene, but early in the movie, we see him chuck a football and we know that, but he's at college for an academic scholarship. So again, making this sort of sideways conversation about how you think you understand sizing a character up, but there's really a lot more to them than that. There's a lot more going on to them.
Well, and they play very directly right after the football throw where he is critiquing Dana's choice of textbook that she's bringing,
Absolutely.
And what's funny, again, having seen this in the theater and didn't remember much in that specific moment, you are just not accustomed to that character having that sort of mental acuity.
Absolutely.
And so it's a little jarring when he starts doing that, right? Mm-hmm. Because at first he pulls the books out and what is your natural instinct as a viewer? He's going to poke fun at her. He's going to make fun of her for being the book nerd, the bookworm, the nerd. And then instead, what does he do? He's like, these are the ones you should actually be taking with you. It's, that professor goes through those books all the way in class. These are the ones you should be reading. And just a very smart touch in terms of playing with your expectations as a viewer.
Can we, since you mentioned that moment, can we briefly have a chuckle over he holds the books and looks at Jules and goes like, "Where did you get these? What did you do with these?" And she said, "I got it from you. I learned it from watching you."
That's a great moment.
Like it's wonderful. I think that the film should be applauded for those subtle touches like that and how it's sort of entering in through the window or through the back door into these conversations. And I think you and I talked about this, and obviously, one of the primary thrusts of our show is that we look at these horror films through a lens of faith, through a Christian perspective. I think that this film could be seen to maybe even a great degree as kind of an indictment of what we would classify as like old time religion, fire and brimstone kind of religion, this ancient sort of sacrificial ritual kind of thing. I think that I don't know specifically because I think there's a lot more other things going on in the film, but I know you could definitely walk out of a viewing of Cabin in the Woods, and if you were not a religious thinker, you would walk away going like, "Yep, this is what it's all like. It's all about punishment. Punish the transgressors to appease the ancient ones, as it is." And I would not be surprised if that was deliberate and intentional. I don't know much about Drew Goddard's stance on faith on a personal level, but I know Whedon, I think, is at the very least an agnostic, maybe even an atheist. And it wouldn't surprise me if there was some intentional sort of indicting of religious thought and religious constructs in the narrative of this film.
I would agree. I think the movie has a very clear agenda and indictment of what I would call, I don't know if they would quite call it this, but like a systematic religion. The do's and don'ts, regard punishment or otherwise. Just that there is this very rigid, systematized version of how existence is supposed to be executed, and almost any world religion has a version of that. And I think, I would agree with you that it really isn't. In fact, it really isn't very subtle in the movie. Right. That we're gonna break the shackles of the system and let the people do what the people are gonna do. Something that I was pondering. You and I spoke on the phone earlier today, just kind of pre-hashing some of our thoughts on this movie, and as I've given it more bandwidth, there's a line that kind of hasn't left me. I wrote it down when I watched it last night, and I even kind of before we started recording just wanted to make sure I had some of the context right and looked it up again. But there's a line late in the movie, and I believe it's Marty. It's either Marty or Dana in that final scene with Sigourney Weaver, where she as the director has sort of expounded upon what's going on, and this is what has to happen, and this is the way it's always been. And the line that I wrote down is, "It's time to give someone else a chance."
Yeah.
And I just found that a really juicy line, if you will. And we started the podcast flirting with the political. I'm going to dive into it a little bit more here. Like, it is hard for me, as what I would want to feel like I am, a discerning person of faith looking at the world. It is hard not to look at these major political movements that have happened in the last year, like your Brexit, like even your Trump election, and not think these are the results of older generations' response to what they dislike or are uncomfortable with. And you could make a case that that's a broad generalization, but this is our show. Yes, I'll leave that comment there. But I've got a dear friend here in town, who just tonight, posted on Facebook this really lovely, he's a teacher, and he's spending some time this weekend at an academic event with some students. And he posted this thing that I thought was so powerful that I kind of shared it. In a nutshell, he's basically espousing what he feels is the virtue of this generation. And he says, for those who decry millennials, for being vapid or narcissistic, this is his words. I say you need to turn off your hate TV and websites and come visit with me. For those feeling depressed about the future, spend time with more students. There are some amazing people coming behind you that are going to clean up the messes you've made, and they'll do it with an inspiring amount of love in their hearts. And I just thought that was a really lovely, just good Lord, we need that sort of reminder and encouragement. But, I feel like, to harken back to witches, this pledged is pledged idea, like in some ways, Cabin in the Woods is playing with that. There is this intentional willingness to sacrifice, to literally, but you could say it figuratively as well in our real world. Like in order for the system to maintain, we've got to keep feeding the beast, literally in the movie. And for me, this may seem like a stretch. I don't know. But did you ever read any of Brian McLaren's New Kind of Christian stuff?
I did. Yeah. I read the whole trilogy. Yeah. The New Kind of Christian, last chapter and the chapter after that. I forget what the middle book is.
I'm going to ring the bell on you. It's actually the last word and the word after that.
Oh, yes. You are correct.
But, there are a lot of people who don't like Brian McLaren. I like Brian McLaren. I think he's got a lot of interesting things to say. And the more I pondered this thought of a generation in the movie, a bureaucracy willingly sacrificing others to serve what they perceive as the greater good, this sort of means end kind of philosophy, this kept coming to me. He talks in Last Word and Word After That about this notion that Christians of the Middle Ages, if they were to visit churches at the time he wrote it, it was probably 2008 or so. Not even that. It's probably been about 10 or 15 years since he wrote that. That if they were to come visit and see our forms of expression of faith today, they would have no idea what to make of it and would call us heretics.
Yeah, right.
And the point he's simply trying to make is that, and let me put it this way, I'm extrapolating a point from what I think he's trying to make, is that though the essence of who God is and the character of who God is, let's use these words, immutable. It's unchangeable. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Nonetheless, our expression of our perception and understanding of who he is constantly changes. I know that seems odd, but this notion of time to give someone else a chance really resonated. And you couple that with my teacher friends' view of this younger generation and how they're passionate and ready and interested and eager to sort of clean up the messes of the generations that are kind of screwing it up ahead of them. This idea you can't put new wine in old wineskins. Like, you have to, as a believer. And I think this is very, very difficult, especially the older we get and the more rigid we grow in our systems of faith. You have to be open and available and flexible with faith, with your faith and how it's expressed and how you worship and how the language you use to talk about God. Is that making sense at all?
Oh, absolutely.
Like what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Yeah.
I know that this movie is not interested in a theistic sort of conversation. Well, I say that it's not interested in a Yahweh conversation, in a Judeo-Christian conversation, but that's just something that really stuck with me, in that notion of giving someone else a chance. It is hard to deny. As I look at my kids, I look at my kids and I think, goodness gracious, what are you going to inherit from, sure, my generation, but on up ahead of me and you and I as well? Like, they're going to have the chance to form it in their own way. And woe are we, our generation, our parents' generation and on up, to wag our finger and say, no. Right. This is strictly and only how God is. Mm-hmm. This is strictly and only how your expression of God should be. I think that's a very dangerous sort of position to take. And I think the movie, though not interested in a Judeo-Christian conversation, is interested in a more freedom kind of conversation, that being, you break the system. Right. You break the system, because once you break the system that has bound you to rigidity, that's when, let's use our own language here, our own faith language, that's when you're fully ready and able and capable to kind of see the world around you the way God actually sees it. I think.
Yeah,
that's a big diatribe there. So.
Well, I think that's what you're saying about the position of the film is probably why the system purge button has no failsafe. That's probably why it's, out in the open. Yeah, you have to break the system. It's there prominent for anybody to come along and to accomplish that. I think that I resonate with a lot of what you're saying. I'm actually not as fond of Brian McLaren and his thought processes as you are, but I do sense in him a tremendous sincerity. And I admire sort of the way that he's trying to bridge the gap for a lot of people. I think that don't necessarily know how to reconcile themselves with what we would perhaps deem orthodoxy, as it were. But I think one of the things that stuck out to me in this film, and to your point, when asked, once Dana and Marty make it into the chamber down there and they're looking around and seeing all the figures, Dana realizes, no, it wasn't just about killing us. It was about punishing us. She says that. It's like, it was about punishing us. And then Marty says, why? And that's when the director emerges and her first words are, because you're young.
Yeah.
Because you are, it's your youth. And what are the gigantic beings that are going to come and destroy the world? What are they called? The Ancient Ones. They're called,
sure.
The Ancients. And they are, there's a line in the film that I didn't write down and can't remember verbatim, but basically there's a moment where the security guard Truman is sitting there sort of processing all of what he's seeing. And the other person who's sort of working with Bradley Whitford and Richard Jenkins, I believe her character's name is Lynn. Lynn is telling him, this is old, these ancient gods, monsters, stuff of nightmares kind of thing. And then she says to him, you get used to it. And he says, should you? And I loved that because the moment then cuts to something else that's happening somewhere else in the narrative. But, she's basically telling him yeah, this is a lot of sort of craziness, but you get used to it. And he's like, should you? And I know a significant amount of people who have, I'm going to characterize what I think is an understanding of Christianity for a lot of people. I think this is false, but I think a lot of people see Christianity as a system of rules and regulations given by a rigid and angry God who then just constantly has to be appeased. That we constantly have to work hard and suffer. And what happens? We transgress and we are punished. That it's this very sort of wrathful kind of idea of religion. And to the people who hold that opinion about religion, my first response would be to repent and apologize, because there's a significant amount of preachers out there who put forth that perspective. They talk about it in that kind of language. They issue it forth in that kind of language. And something that struck me in this conversation about if you don't transgress, you won't be punished, or if you transgress, you'll be punished. Something that stuck out to me was this notion of, I think we have a belief, or we have a perspective, that all, or if not all, most of the commandments that have been given to us to somehow make God happy. That God somehow delights in giving us a ton of, hoops that we have to jump through, a ton of things that we have to do. The film itself, it's implied in that conversation between Lynn and Truman that the monsters came from the Ancient Ones, that all of these beings that are in these cubes are actually creations of the Ancient Ones. And when that implication was made, I was like, wow, so the Ancient Ones essentially let loose all these monsters or gave them this system for something that's never going to be resolved. It's just going to be repeated and repeated and repeated. And, these gods are constantly, we're not given really a time frame. Maybe it's annually, maybe it's monthly, maybe it's weekly. God, that's terrifying. But these gods have to be appeased, constantly. And if they're not, they only mess up once. In the narrative of the film, it all only falls apart once. So you think about all of these different times that, these victims have been sort of offered up, this ritualistic thing. And I think there's a significant amount of people who see religion as that. And, to be more specific, see Christianity as that. Like, oh, well, you've got to, bow down before this God. I've heard prominent atheists speak about it in that kind of language. And to be honest, I don't blame them given the way that some believers talk about it. But that is not what I see in the text of the Gospels. It's not what I see in my understanding of what Christianity really at its substance is. As a parent, and I'm sure you probably will relate to or maybe nuance this a little bit, a lot of the a lot of the instruction that I give to my son, if I were him, and I know I did it with my father, if I were him, I'd be, you get the idea of, man, Dad never lets me do anything. Like he doesn't understand. He doesn't get it. He never lets me do anything. But I know, as from the perspective of a parent, a lot of times I'm giving these instructions because I don't want harm to come to them. It's for them. Sure. It's not for me. It's not because I'm like, I get to make the rules. It's for their good. It's for their betterment.
Every now and then you do that, though. Let's be honest.
I do. It always feels so good. But in all sincerity, that it's like, it's not that I delight in all the rules and regulations that I have to hand down to my son. I don't delight in that. What I delight in is in being in relationship with my son. That's what gives me joy. That's what gives me pleasure, is just spending time with him or playing Disney Infinity with him, or those are the things that I delight in. The rules are basically just there to teach him how to be in the world, because if he does not abide by them, there will be consequences that will bring pain into his life, that will bring suffering into his life. And it's interesting to me because I'm looking at this film, and in this film, the ancient ones want the punishment. That's how they're appeased. They want this punishment to take place. And I think a sizable amount of people who are not Christians, or maybe some people who are Christians, perhaps see God in that light. And I do not think that is at all the character and heart of God, that he delights in punishment. I wrote down as a possible scripture verse to reference Matthew chapter 9 and verse 13. It's a moment when Jesus is being criticized for eating with tax collectors. And it's in the Gospel of Matthew, it's right after he's actually called a tax collector, Matthew, to come and be one of his disciples. And, they say to him, hey, why are you eating with tax collectors? And he responds to them, he says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And he specifically says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He's quoting there a passage from Hosea, chapter 6, verse 6. And I think that is more indicative of the heart of God.
Sure.
The book of Ezekiel says, I don't desire for the wicked to perish. That's not what I want. I think so many times we, believers or non-believers alike, can look at sort of the system and think that the purpose of the system is indeed what the purpose of the system in Cabin in the Woods is, for us to just perpetually suffer, to keep God happy. And no wonder.
Kept in line.
Yeah, exactly. Fall in line, do this. And Nathan, no wonder people reject that idea of a relationship with God. No wonder people reject serving someone who would simply punish in cyclical patterns and have great delight from punishing in cyclical patterns. I do not believe, as a devout Christian, as what I consider myself to be a devout Orthodox Christian, I do not believe that is the heart and character of God. But I understand, given the way people talk about it, and given the way people act and behave to others, why a sizable amount of people do believe that about God. I want to invite you to.
Well, and it's fascinating. It's just fascinating to me, like the language Jesus uses. It's not that I don't get it. We want a system gets created to, at least at its inception, to make a thing more streamlined, to make a thing less complex, to make a thing easier to sort of make sense of. I understand the impulse, but at the same time, it's hard to hear something like the statement of Jesus, I've come that they might have life and have it, use whatever sort of version you want here, have it to the full, abundant life. Like, I just don't see Jesus referring to a rigid system as abundant life.
Right. Right.
Like now guys, I know I said abundant life. And I know what you think that means, but what it really means is like, just do all of these very strict things.
Right.
Then that's abundant life. Like, well, no, I just, I don't, I think the minute you can begin to step away from your system, Philip Yancey, I know you're familiar with, and it's been years since I've read his stuff, but in one of his books, and probably many of them, but I think there was one in particular that he really honed in on this. He talked about where he actually, what made him believe, basically. And it was nature, music, and romantic love. That these three things were indicators of, to him, the existence of God, or helped grow his own personal faith. And I think that's sort of what I'm trying to talk about here. And I think maybe you're at least alluding to, like, not those three things specifically, but as in, you've got to be able to abandon the system and let the Lord actually reveal himself. Yeah. Because he's just not, I'm sorry, but he's just not revealed in the system. The system just keeps you in line. I mean, frankly, the Lord wants you to say, hey, step out of the line and we'll go run and play together and I'll show you wondrous things and you'll get to have abundant life. And I know what I'm saying feels very unrelated to the movie, but it's just sort of piggybacking on some of what you're, I think, articulating.
Yeah. And perhaps as we eyeball kind of steering towards home, one of the things that I've said often, it's important to me to distinguish for some of my Christian friends. This is specifically to some people who are very troubled by the language of change, or the language of, we're growing and shifting. Well, are you manipulating the scriptures for your own purposes and intentions? And, one of the things that I deeply believe is what you were saying, talking about the system. I kept mentally inserting and substituting the word system for the word law. And, that, and where we are told, by the writings of Paul that, hey, we were under the law. And the law served a purpose, a very important, valuable gift it was supposed to be seen to us. But he said, with Christ, now you're not under the law anymore. And one of the things that sometimes I have to make a distinction for people is you start talking about changing climate or changing the way you interact with people, or shifts in faith. Boy, I'm about to make a statement that could get me in a lot of trouble, but I'm just going to go for it. One of the things that I've try to distinguish for people is I deeply believe that God is the same, that he is constant from Old Testament to New Testament. So how I reconcile the difference in language between the Old Testament and the New Testament is this, that we had the law, and nothing about the law changed with the coming of Jesus Christ, in my belief. Nothing about it really changed. What did change, nothing about the nature of God changed, nothing about the law changed. What did change, and it changed fully, completely, and utterly, was the way a sinful people engage with a holy God. That changed. That game changed completely after the coming of Christ and after Christ's completed work. So I think what's significant for us to remember is I think there's still a lot of people who, if they had to be, this is the statement, they just some people need to start being honest with themselves that at the end of the day, they trust following the law to redeem them more than they trust the completed work of Christ to redeem them. Sure. They trust being good, not transgressing. They trust making sure that they have followed the law to redeem them. And instead of surrendering to the game changer that we believe to be the coming of Jesus Christ, and boy, I think we're getting a lot heavier theologically than we typically do on this show, but I'm not really going to apologize for it because I'm very passionate about this. I deeply believe that there's a lot of very troubled people who feel that it is up to them to save themselves, that because of the system that they have in place, it is up to them, like a massive amount of employees in a control room, it is up to us to appease the gods. It is up to us to make sure we follow the system, punish somebody else, keep the wheels turning, and that is our role. And one thing that I think of is, man, people are going to groan and roll their eyes at this, in my belief of what happened when Christ came, if you want to use the cabin in the woods analogy, it's that Christ didn't say, okay, well, punish somebody else, go ahead and, purge the system, unleash the monsters. Christ himself entered the system, entered it, and unleashed the monsters, if you will, on himself, and took them all on himself, and then in that way undermined the system, and undermined and completed everything that needed to be completed for that. And that's what I would express is the gospel, is that, hey, you don't have to go out to the cabin in the woods anymore. You don't have to fear or to worry about that anymore, because that has already been appeased. The gods have forever been appeased. The penalty for sin has forever been paid, has forever been taken care of. That the price, the wages of death have been accomplished. And we probably don't have time to really go into all of that theological unpacking. I just dropped a grenade in a backpack, and there it was.
I adore the fact that has become part of the Fear of God vernacular. Is just tossing a grenade in a backpack, in a JanSport, backpack. But isn't that fascinating though, Reed? I mean, I would agree with you, and to the extent, and I'm a fan of Joss Whedon, and when he's got a movie out, I read interviews and things like that. Like, he definitely, well, I don't want to speak for the man's faith. My gleaning is that he definitely is not a person of faith, and B, definitely more on the agnostic, if not atheist side, very much a humanist, which has its own virtues unto itself, and don't want to discredit that whatsoever. But isn't it interesting that what they would probably intend as an indictment of religion, in some ways, syncs up rather well with the work of Christ? Again, theirs is a very nihilistic, if you mess with the system, it's all gone. But our interpretation, our takeaway from that would be, you have to mess with the system, or it's just all going to stay in the cycle anyway. Cabin in the woods.
So there's Cabin in the Woods. We could probably go on for another half hour, but I think that's a good spot to sort of exit the elevator.
Ding.
But I do sincerely want to hear, as I'm sure you do, Nathan, we want to hear what you guys think about this film. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but as we always say, not the end of the conversation. So obviously you guys wanted us to have a conversation about this movie. We thank you again for responding to that survey. And on that note, you're going to see, a number of other results from the survey come out in the next few months. But specifically on this film, I'm very curious to hear your guys' thoughts on it. Was there anything else that you would add to the conversation? Reach out to us by social media or in a variety of ways. You can follow us on Twitter. What's our Twitter handle?
The podcast Twitter handle is @thefearofgod.
And you can also like us on Facebook. There's a link there on Twitter to do that. And you could also follow me on Twitter @ReedLackey. Nathan, where can they find you on Twitter?
They can find me on Twitter @TheNathanRouse. And you might be going here, Reed, so I apologize if I'm jumping the gun here. But in the case you weren't, we would encourage you guys, some of you have been very faithful to have done this lately. It's helpful to us to have some positive words on iTunes specifically. So if you're enjoying the show, which we really hope you are, we certainly enjoy bringing the show to you. So would really appreciate, sharing a little bit of love on iTunes with a review. Let your friends know we're out here, and we certainly enjoy making the show for you. So I cut you off, Reed. I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, please do leave us an iTunes review. And just two final notes. You can go to morethanonelesson.com to comment on some of these individual posts, and you can also email us at fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. That's fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. And otherwise, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that it was all that you hoped for when you voted for it. So follow us on social media to see what we're going to be talking about next week. We're going to be heading into a couple of Christmassy, December-themed episodes here at The Fear of God. But sincerely, Nathan, thank you very, very much for having this conversation with me and taking the time. I appreciate it.
Indeed, my friend.
And we'll talk to you guys next week.